Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here celebrating with Peter and with all of us, all of you who admire Peter so much. So Peter, like a whole bunch of contemporary philosophers, is a materialist about human persons. He thinks that you and I and all of us birthday celebrants are material. And his materialism invites the question, a question that I'm going to ask about myself, but you might want to ask an analogous question about yourself. Which material thing am I? Put in terms of the ideology of composition and introductory physics, we might ask, of all the collections of subatomic particles out there, which one exactly is such that its members compose me? We can call this collection, I'll call that collection, if there is such a collection, the me particles, or me. Okay, as soon as I ask the question, very many candidate answers present themselves. And even if I narrow down the candidates to material objects that are, say, humanoid rather than feline or cerebral, and even if I further narrow down those candidates to ones that are over here on this side of the lectern, there still seem to be very many candidates. Right? In line with what Peter Geach and Peter Unger, and perhaps other Peters, pointed out nearly half a century ago, it's evident that for any collection of collectively humanoid particles over here that I might care to identify as the me particles, there are many other such collections that are also collectively humanoid, arranged in human form, and over here, and which nearly completely coincide with the first collection. But so far, this isn't obviously troublesome for the materialist, right? An abundance of possible answers is certainly better than none. The trouble begins, of course, when we note that whichever is the right answer to the question of which collection composes me, right? The right answer to the question of what I am, each of the other possible answers seems to be the right answer to an analogous question one could ask about some human being who is just as conscious as I am, but who isn't me. That is, if the me particles compose me, then it would seem pretty clear that each of the other collections of collectively humanoid particles over here also composes something, that something is human with an inner life as rich as my own. Or even more simply, if the me particles compose me, then there are very many other conscious beings standing right where I am right now. But it's as evident as anything is that there aren't very many conscious beings standing right where I am right now. So we can conclude that it's not the case that the me particles compose me. And that is a troubling conclusion for materialism. Right? For the me particles, that was just shorthand for the collection of particles whose members compose me. If there is such a collection, its members do compose me. So the only way it could fail to be the case that the me particles compose me is if there is no such collection at all. But how could that be, right, if materialism is true? If I'm a material object? We could just go through all the particles in the universe, sorting them into those that are parts of me and those that aren't. Collect the ones that are parts of me. If I'm a material object, and so I have no immaterial parts, then presumably anything that overlaps me overlaps at least one such particle. And obviously, each such particle is a part of me. I said I'm going through and collecting all the ones that are parts of me. And we can stipulate the particles don't overlap. So if I am a material object, then there just has to be such a collection of particles, i.e. the collection of all the particles that are parts of me whose members compose me, or at least so it seems. Right? That chain of reasoning can, of course, be converted into an argument against materialism. And it has been. I'll put the argument, as you have it on your handout, as the immaterialist argument from the many. And I'll just note, even though I call it the immaterialist argument from the many, it's not quite an argument for immaterialism. It's an argument for the falsity of materialism. But since immaterialism, which I take to be the claim that each of us is an immaterial object, or at least partly immaterial, entails that each of us exists, entails at the very least that I exist, it doesn't follow straightforwardly from the falsity of materialism that immaterialism is true. Essentially, what I have succeeded, if I succeed in this argument, in showing is that either I don't exist at all or I'm immaterial. Okay, but that's work for another time, showing that I exist. which also bears on Peter's own work, but I'm not going to discuss that today. So in any case, that's just about the name, the title of the argument. It's an argument for the conclusion that it's not the case that I am material, and I'm not going to read all of the verbiage here. There's too much. But essentially, the first premise is just this very intuitive thought that we just said, that if I'm material, then there is some collection of particles, the me particles, I've called them, that compose me. The second premise is the premise that captures the idea that if there's that collection, then there are all these other collections, and that they compose objects. Okay, so it's built into that premise. I've combined those two ideas there, that there are all these other collections that overlap and differ ever so slightly by this particle or that particle, and they all compose objects. The third premise says that since I'm conscious, and all of these things differ from me ever so slightly by a particle here, a particle there, all of these things are also conscious. And then the fourth premise is supposed to be very trivial, although it turns out, of course, in philosophy, nothing is trivial, but this is supposed to be just, if you understand what it is to count, you'll see that if you're all these things, and they're all conscious, and they're all distinct from one another, then there are many conscious beings where I am. The fifth premise is just the denial that there are many conscious beings where I am. Okay, so we can infer that it's not the case that I am material. Okay, now I'm going to register my view. I think the immaterialist argument from the many, as I've called it, is quite compelling. One of the most compelling philosophical arguments out there. To be sure, if Peter is right, that's like saying of someone that she's one of the most right-leaning communists out there. But that's still something. Now, to those familiar, though, with the problem of the many, my assessment might in any case sound overly rosy. Right? The problem of the many is an extremely fruitful metaphysical puzzle, I think we can all agree. And it can, of course, be recast as an argument, analogous to the one I've just given, for the nihilistic conclusion that there are no clouds, tables, cats, or even human organisms. Recasting it in that way and drawing the nihilistic conclusion is just what Unger did. Now, just to show, and for the purpose of the rest of the talk, it's going to be helpful to have this other argument, to show just how analogous the immaterialist and nihilist arguments from the many are, we can offer a statement of the nihilist argument, which I think is as compelling a statement of the nihilist argument as any, despite the fact there are going to be some things that aren't as perspicuous as one might like. But still, I think it's as compelling as a formulation of the nihilist argument as you'll find, and it is structurally identical to the immaterialist argument. Okay, so the setup is just, I point in the direction of a paradigmatic cat. For some reason, it's always a cat. That is, if anything is a cat, there's a cat over there. And I say, let's call that cat over there Pete. You could see that I didn't have a cat, unlike Lewis and other philosophers who had cats. I'm familiar with cats mostly from my children and what they read. So then Pete the cat. Then the following argument, okay, that you have here, nihilist argument from the many, seems to show that it's not the case that Pete is a cat, and so that there are no cats after all. Okay, I'm not going to read this. This you can just try to compare yourselves, premise for premise. It's structurally identical to the immaterialist argument from the many, and the conclusion is that it's not the case that Pete is a cat. But now that you have both of them on the table, or you have both of them in front of you on this handout, you might reasonably judge the immaterialist argument to be manufactured in the very same mold as, and no more compelling than, its nihilistic cousin. But very few people, very few philosophers, are convinced by the nihilist argument to accept the nihilistic conclusion. Indeed, every premise in the nihilistic argument has been denied, and some for multiple reasons. And so, you might conclude, the correct response to the nihilist argument, whatever it is, can serve as a materialist response to the immaterialist argument from the many. And so it hardly seems right, then, to count the immaterialist argument from the many among the most compelling philosophical arguments out there. But that's too quick, that reaction. Right? Despite their structural similarity or even identity, the immaterialist argument, I think, is much more compelling than its nihilistic cousin. In my view, nearly every response to the nihilist argument and every plausible response fails as a solution to the problem facing materialist. I don't have time to enter into all the details regarding each of the responses, For obvious reasons, I want to focus on Peter's, that is, our Peter's. But in order to set the stage for my discussion of that response, I will need to say a few words about some of the others. Okay, so start with the response that just denies premise 5. That is, consider the response to the nihilist argument that just embraces the many, okay, the many clouds, tables, cats, and since we can run this regarding any of these things, human organisms. Right, now, that might not be terribly problematic as long as those clouds and tables and cats and human organisms aren't themselves conscious. But conscious beings are a whole other ball of wax. Now, Unger himself has, of course, made the same claim, but his grounds for making an exception of conscious beings are very different from the ones I find persuasive. As I see matters, the great difficulty in embracing very many conscious beings where I am doesn't lie in its disagreement with common sense. Right? So even setting aside Peter's comments and thoughts and criticisms of the philosophical misuse of the term common sense, disagreement with common sense, I don't think, is going to provide I don't think that's going to provide a sufficient reason to tenaciously hold on to premise 5. The reason being that whatever response we give to the argument is going to flout some piece of what philosophers call common sense. So the problem of the many just shows us, among other things, that common sense isn't consistent. Nor do I think the great difficulty in embracing very many conscious beings lies in its disagreement with our perceptual evidence, right? As though we could just see that this isn't true. I don't think I can just see the absence of all these intimate companions. I'm not sure where I would look exactly, but wherever I would look, I don't think I could manage to see that. Right? As far as I see things, the difficulty in denying premise 5 lies in the absurd moral and practical implications. Right? It would mean, as Jonathan Simon has argued recently, that when deciding between kidney donor recipients, all else being equal, we should donate to the one with the greater surface area, since we'd thereby be saving more conscious human beings. It would mean, and now I'm adding, that in deciding whether to donate a kidney at all, there'd be an ethical consideration against donating as weighty as I'd have under the following condition. Millions of others will automatically suffer whatever discomfort I do, and in the unlikely event that I incur death or serious injury, millions of others will likewise suffer death or serious injury. And it would make any decision whether to bungee jump as morally charged as the decision to do so under the following condition. Millions of others will enjoy the same great thrill as I do, but if I incur death or serious injury, then they will too. Right, these, I think, are literally incredible implications of denying 5. It cannot be believed. And so we simply can't consistently deny that premise. In any case, whether we can manage to pull that task off, these implications give us, I think, overwhelmingly good reason not to do so, not to deny premise 5. And here I would just add, I think the same goes for a Lewisian denial of premise 4. One of Lewis's response to this argument was to say that, right, in some contexts, we should count tables and cats and human organisms by almost identity rather than strict identity. Right? Now, there might well be contexts, many contexts, I'm willing to grant, in which counting by some relation other than strict identity is called for. And there might even be contexts in which counting conscious beings by some relation other than strict identity is called for. But those contexts in which the morality of what you're doing depends on how many conscious beings there are just aren't among them. So we could just run the whole argument in such a context, the immaterialist argument from the many. OK, that's if we deny premise 5 or relatedly premise 4. OK, now consider, suppose instead the right response, the response you want to go with to the nihilist argument is the supervaluationalist denial of premise 3, which is another one of Lewis's responses, and others developed it as well. Right, where any cat is, the response goes, there are indeed countless cat-shaped, massively overlapping objects. Each is an equally good candidate for being a cat. But the term cat is vague. For each of the cat-shaped objects, on some admissible ways of precisifying the term, that object is in its extension, and on some ways it isn't. So each of the cat-shaped objects is only indeterminately a cat. Nonetheless, there are so-called penumbral connections between overlapping cat candidates. And any admissible precisification of that term will assign exactly one such object to its extension. So the upshot is, there are indeed very many cat-shaped objects where Pete is, but none is definitely a cat. And it's nonetheless definitely the case that there's exactly one cat where Pete is, and indeed, definitely the case that Pete is a cat. Since none of the objects is definitely a cat, we avoid the need for an arbitrary selection principle, right? It's a principle that says, OK, it's this object and not the other ones, which seems quite arbitrary and doesn't smell right. And we can also hold on to the very powerful thought, which the supervaluationist also wants to hold on to, that anything that's cat indistinguishable from a definite cat is itself a cat, right? They can hold on to that because none of these objects are definite cats. OK, but this response does little to disarm the immaterialist argument for at least three reasons, two having to do with a difference in the predicates, the third with a difference in the subject. OK, let's start with the predicate. The predicate x is conscious, that is the predicate that's relevant for most of the argument, right, certainly doesn't seem to be vague and doesn't appear to admit of multiple precisifications. For anything whatsoever, either that thing is definitely conscious or that thing is definitely not conscious. After all, either it's lights on inside or it's lights out. Even a dim or fuzzy light is a light. There's either some way it's like to be you or there isn't, period. Of course, sometimes we get woozy or lightheaded, but that's not a case in which it's indeterminate whether we're conscious. It's perfectly determinate that we're conscious when we feel woozy. It's the character of our experience that's fuzzy, not its existence. Since nothing is indeterminately conscious, none of the me sub n's, all of these me's, me1, me2, and so on, is indeterminately conscious. OK, so if none is definitely conscious, then each is definitely not conscious. Then it's definitely not the case that there's a conscious being here, right? That one's definitely not conscious, that one's definitely not conscious, so it's definitely the case there's no conscious being here. I object. Not the result we want. There's definitely a conscious being over here. If, on the other hand, at least one is definitely conscious, then all of them are definitely conscious, right? The reason being that powerful thought that I just cited that even the supervaluationist wants to hold on to, right? That if it's conscious indistinguishable from something that's definitely conscious, then it's going to be definitely conscious. It's going to be conscious and even definitely conscious. OK, so then all of them will be definitely conscious, and so we're basically back to square one when it comes to that predicate being x is conscious. On top of that, this is another point about the predicate, even if the predicate is vague, and even if it were to admit multiple precisifications, it's just not plausible that the needed penumbral connections exist. Right? There doesn't seem to be anything about the semantics of the term conscious that precludes there being two or more distinct but massively overlapping conscious beings, the way there might be when it comes to x is a cat. Right? There might even be related sortal terms related to x is conscious, like x is a person, whose semantics maybe does preclude there being two or more distinct but massively overlapping persons. But consciousness, that property expressed by the predicate x is conscious, seems obviously intrinsic, right? And so plausibly, its instantiation makes no absolutely necessary demands on its environment. Now that's a contentious claim that I just made, that it's intrinsic. If as Ted Sider thinks, that isn't true of the property being conscious, I don't think that's going to make much of a difference, right? Basically, that view is that it's not true of the property expressed by our term x is conscious, but it's still true of a nearby property, consciousness star, which is wholly a matter of what it's like to be that thing, and wholly intrinsic. Right? And then the term we use, maybe x is conscious, picks out a property that turns out to be extrinsic because it's a matter of having that property of being conscious star, and then something else, like not massively overlapping many other beings that have that property. Right? But if we're talking about the property of being an x, such that there's some way it's like to be x, I don't think there's a clearer instance of an intrinsic property. I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A if you think size or shape or something is a better candidate. Right? And if that's right, we can just rewrite the immaterialist argument replacing conscious with conscious star, whatever the property is, whatever term we need to use to express that property that is in fact intrinsic. Right? And then all the premises, including the denial of the many conscious beings, still seem plausible in the extreme. Okay, so the central predicate term, I'd say, is special, different from the ones that play a role in the nihilist argument. But the same is true, I think, about the subject term. It's also special, relevantly special, that is special for our purposes. It may be special in other ways also. Right? So the subject term in the nihilist argument for the many was Pete. Right? Pete was our name for that cat over there. And according to supervaluationism, the demonstrative term that I use to fix the referent of Pete, that cat over there, is vague. Right? And so then the name Pete is going to inherit all that vagueness. Right? And that's why we're not entitled to infer, as you have this on your handout, you have A, B, C there. We can't get from A to C. That's exactly the inference that they want to block. Right? They're willing to grant, they very much want us to grant, definitely Pete is a cat. Right? But they don't want us to get to the conclusion, they don't think it's true, that there is something over there that's definitely a cat. Okay? And the reason that they can block this is because Pete, the name Pete, is not precise. It's itself a vague term. But if Pete, the name Pete, were perfectly precise, right, if it just admitted of one precisification, then we could, in fact, we would be entitled to infer from A that Pete is definitely a cat. Right? Compare, if it's definitely the case that electron 1 is negatively charged, we can infer that electron 1 is definitely negatively charged, right? Assuming that electron 1, that term, is precise. At least I don't see any obstacle to that inference. And then from there, we could conclude that there is something, in that case, that's negatively charged, or that's definitely negatively charged. And in this case, there is something over there that's definitely a cat. Now, to be clear, right, just to reiterate, they don't think that inference goes through, and they're right in that case, right, in the case of Pete. But when it comes to A prime, B prime, and C prime, I think matters are different. Right? That's precisely the situation I'm in regarding my own convictions about my being conscious. That is the situation that I just described regarding electron. Right? Look at A prime. Definitely, I am conscious. I'm thinking and believing A prime right now. The first person pronoun, as it features in that thought, admits of no precisification. When I think that thought, the function of the first person pronoun is to allow for self-reference and self-predication. Right? If any of me1, me2, me3, etc. manages to think A prime, and the supervaluationist better concede that one of them is able to, then in so doing, it unequivocally refers to and predicates a feature of itself. Right? Now, I'll note parenthetically that even if you deny that that's the function of the first person pronoun in ordinary language and thought, maybe you have some more elaborate theory that doesn't vindicate that, what I think is rather commonsensical idea, that it's a vehicle for self-reference and self-predication, there doesn't seem to be any obstacle to just introducing a mental device whose purpose is to unequivocally self-refer and self-predicate. Even if it's true that massively overlapping thinkers can literally share a thought, which is something I'm not at all sure of, that's no obstacle to the successful employment of this device of self-reference. Because the fact that overlapping thinkers can, in some cases maybe, literally share the very same thought doesn't imply that there are no thoughts that overlapping thinkers don't and even can't literally share. Right? So then I could just put this little argument in terms of that special purpose first-person pronoun, but I won't do that. I'll just use the ordinary I, and hopefully we're all in agreement that that is the purpose of the word I. So then I am entitled to infer from A prime, I'm entitled to infer B prime. Right? From the fact that definitely I am conscious, I can infer I am definitely conscious, from which I'm entitled to infer there is something. Right? If I am, then there is something that's definitely conscious. And now I'm back to square one again. Right? Since one of us over here is definitely conscious, There's something over here that's definitely conscious. All of us are definitely conscious, the whole horde, because of the powerful thought that even the supervaluationist wants to retain. And so I get the conclusion that there are very many definitely conscious beings where I am. OK, that was all by way of setup to the view that I really want to focus on, which is Peter's view. OK, so as I see it, none of the leading responses to the general problem of the many is of any use in contending with the immaterialist argument. Right, but that shouldn't bother Peter, since his response to the problem of the many is different. Indeed, Peter might take everything I've said as good evidence that he's right, maybe even as a birthday present, since the other responses provide no adequate reply to the immaterialist argument, whether or not they succeed as replies to the nihilistic argument. Of course, Peter doesn't believe in clouds or even tables or chairs, but he does believe in cats and human organisms and other living things. So Peter has to say something in response to the nihilist argument. And what he says, or at least what I take to be the crux of what Peter says, is that cats and dogs and human organisms are all vague objects, right? Which is not to say they only kind of sort of exist. It's to say that there are some things that are only kind of sort of parts of them. So there is some one thing over there, Pete, that's definitely a cat. But there is no collection of particles, or of other objects except for Pete, that definitely compose him. That is, there is some thing over there, Y, that is definitely a cat, and nothing over there other than Y is a cat. And yet it's not the case that there are any X's that satisfy the definition of composition, such that definitely each of the X's is part of Y. Anything that overlaps Y overlaps at least one of the X's, and none of the X's overlap. And the explanation is, right, that alongside all of the particles that are definitely parts of Pete, and those that are definitely not parts of Pete, there are those particles such that it's indeterminate whether they're parts of Pete. So take any collection of particles. If it includes none but those that are definitely parts of Pete, then it won't definitely compose Pete, since it won't be definitely the case that anything that overlaps Pete overlaps at least one of the particles in the collection. On the other hand, if it includes all of those that are either definitely or indeterminately parts of Pete, then it won't be definitely the case that they're all parts of Pete. It might have too many particles. And if it includes some but not all of those that are indeterminately parts of Pete, then it'll fail on both grounds to definitely compose Pete. It might, so to speak, be missing some particles, and it might have too many. Now the claim, Peter's claim, that cats and dogs and human organisms are all vague objects bears rather clearly, straightforwardly, on the nihilist argument. Right? If that claim is true, then premise one of the argument is false. Right? At least if we understand it in such a way that the argument is not going to equivocate. Right? The premise one of the argument being, if I am material, then there is some collection of particles, the me particles, that compose me. Right? Because, premise one of the nihilist argument. If Pete is a cat, then there is some collection of particles, the Pete particles that compose Pete. Right? For while Pete is a cat, indeed, while Pete is definitely a cat, there is no collection of particles that definitely compose Pete. Putting the point in quantificational terms rather than using the name Pete, just so it's clear that it has nothing to do with any vagueness in the name Pete, there is a definite cat, and hence a definitely composite object over there, such that no particular collection of particles definitely composes it. Now there's much to say about the vague object response. One might argue that there are no vague objects because there couldn't be vague objects, and that there couldn't be vague objects because the idea is incoherent. For there to be two things such that one is only indeterminately part of the other seems to require vagueness or fuzziness in the world, and not just in how we represent the world. After all, the word part, often said to be a broadly logical term, seems perfectly precise. So any indeterminacy in whether a given thing is part of another given thing would have to have its source in the world rather than in our words. And there was a time, I gather, when one could comfortably pronounce such worldly fuzziness to be nonsense or inconceivable, and most of your fellow metaphysicians would nod in agreement. Well, whether for good or for bad, that time is in the past, perhaps due in no small measure to Peter. At any rate, that's one thing you might argue. You might instead argue that the claim that cats and dogs are vague objects doesn't actually help address the problem of the many at all. I'm going to skip this. This is a point that others have made that arises because of higher order vagueness. It, too, is not the problem, even though I think it's a serious problem, is not the problem I want to press. Right? The one I want to develop is rather that exactly as with the other leading responses to the problem of the many, even if it succeeds as a reply to the nihilistic argument, it encounters a serious problem when we deploy it as a reply to the immaterialist argument. Okay, now I'm going to develop this problem in two stages. First, I'm going to assume a version of the vague object view that Peter doesn't actually endorse. Okay, so I'm not imputing this to Peter. But I'm going to argue that it does nothing to address the problem for materialism. Okay, and then based on that, I'm going to then argue regarding the second version of the vague object view, the one that Peter actually does endorse, that even if it does something to address the problem for materialism, it doesn't do nearly enough. So what are the two versions? Well, the vague object reply to the immaterialist argument denies premise one. It says that while I am wholly material, there is no collection of particles that definitely composes me. I'm a vague object, just like Pete and Fido. Right? There's no way to answer my original question to the materialist, which material thing am I? Or at least, there's no way to answer that question by specifying which particles compose me. Okay, but we can still ask, are there, in addition to Pete and Fido and me, precise macroscopic objects? That is, macroscopic objects that aren't vague, some of them feline, some of them canine, and some of them humanoid. The claim that some cats and dogs and human organisms are vague objects, even the claim that all cats and dogs and human organisms are vague objects, is in fact consistent both with a yes answer to that question and with a no. Right, because there could be, along with Pete, very many feline precise objects, just none of them a cat. Okay, and so in my case, it could be that along with me, I'm this vague object, there are very many precise humanoid objects, but none of them a human organism. Okay, so let's just call the view that all macroscopic objects are vague, and that there are macroscopic objects, the pure vague object view. Okay, this is the version, I think, of the vague object view that Peter endorses. And let's call the view that there are macroscopic objects of both sorts, vague and precise, okay, and just to be clear, that there are all the precisifications, so to speak, of the vague object. Okay, so all the me ones and me twos, all of those exist, just like in the case of Pete. Let's call that the hybrid vague object view. Okay, and that's the version of the vague object view, just so you don't think I'm just setting this up as a complete straw man. This is the one that Lewis entertains. When he entertains this solution and rejects it ultimately, but the one he entertains, the version he entertains is this one, the hybrid version. Okay, so start with the hybrid version of the view. On this view, I am a vague object, and alongside me there are also all of the humanoid precise objects that I named in premise 2, that is V1, V2, etc. And if this is going to provide any relief to a materialist, relief from this argument, then it's going to have to be the case that while I am conscious, none of these precise objects is conscious. And you might think that this has something going for it, actually, right? That this isn't terribly implausible. In fact, you might think that this claim about the lack of consciousness of the many precise objects is even more plausible than the analogous claims regarding the lack of cloudhood or cathood or humanity of the many precise objects. Lewis points out it's actually odd, it seems pretty odd, to think that none of the feline precise objects over there is in fact a cat. I mean, there's nothing impossible about being a precise cat. Just imagine if the world had been much less fuzzy than it is, or entirely non-fuzzy. Then we'd have lots of precise cats and precise clouds and so on. Right? And it's unclear, Lewis says, how the presence of a single vague cat could spoil the cathood of all the precise ones. So if alongside the vague objects there are also precise ones, you might think you'll probably still have the many cats and human organisms too. Like when it comes to consciousness, here you might think there's actually an advantage. There could just be some contingent law that prevents anything but a vague object from being conscious. Maybe. It's not out of the question, at least if you're dualist enough about consciousness. And so although we we might all have to concede that there are many human organisms where I am. The materialist need not concede that there are many conscious beings where I am. Only one of the very many human organisms here, the one that's a vague object, will be conscious. Right? Unfortunately for materialism, I think this is out of the question. And the reason it's out of the question consists in the conjunction of a compelling principle that Peter himself lays down about indeterminate identity, and the claim I made earlier that consciousness is never vague. Okay, so note first that if I'm a vague object who exists along with all of the precise humanoid objects over here, it's really hard to avoid the conclusion that I'm indeterminately identical with each of them. Or more precisely, that for each such object, it's indeterminate whether I'm identical with it. Okay, consider Me-23, which is composed of the Me-23 particles. Now, it's not definitely the case that I am composed of the Me-23 particle. That's clear, since I'm a vague object, and it's not. But it seems also pretty clear that it's not definitely not the case that I'm composed of those particles. If that were definitely not the case, it would have to either be definite that one of the Me-23 particles is not part of me, I'm bigger than it, or be definite that something overlaps me but doesn't overlap any of the Me-23 particles. Sorry, the first one was that Me-23 is bigger than me. This is that I'm bigger than Me-23. Neither of which is the case. That is, it's not the case that that's definite. Right? I'm going to return shortly to that argument in a second. But so then, it's indeterminate whether Me-23 and I are composed of the very same particles. Now, if we set aside the possibility of distinct objects composed of the very same particles, in other words, if we assume mereological extensionality, it'll be indeterminate whether Me-23 and I are identical. It's indeterminate whether we're composed of the very same particles. Right? And then the same is going to go for all the Me-Ns. Each one is indeterminately identical with me. So here's the picture, I think, that you have to have. Like if you accept the hybrid view, not the pure view. You have the hybrid view, so you have me, I'm this vague object, and then there are all these precise objects, and I am indeterminately identical with each of them. That is, for each of them, it's indeterminate whether I'm identical with it. Okay? But now, to quote Peter on the interaction between indeterminate identity and property possession, he says, this is on your handout, suppose that it really is indefinite whether x is identical with y. Suppose that y definitely has the property f. Can it really be definitely false that x has the property f? Or as we might put it, if two things aren't definitely distinct, then could it be that the one definitely has some property that the other definitely lacks? It seems not, as Peter compellingly argues, for then they would be definitely distinct. Okay, so at least if it's suitably qualified, and here I'm not, Peter, I think, accepts this principle in an unqualified way. I would prefer to qualify it, but the qualification I don't think is going to make any difference for our purposes. So I'm just going to say, here's Peter's principle, and it seems to be pretty plausible. Right? For any x and y in property f, if it's indeterminate whether x is identical with y, and x definitely has f, then it's not the case that y definitely lacks f. Okay, so for any property I definitely have, none of the Me-Ns, none of these precise humanoid things here, definitely lacks it. Right? It's going to be at least indeterminate whether it has that property. Right? But now we can recall the claim that I made earlier about the determinacy of consciousness, this time formulated in property terms. Right? Here, you have it on your handout as consciousness isn't vague. For any x, either x definitely has the property, being conscious, or x definitely lacks the property, being conscious. Right? Like I said before, there isn't anything that's kind of sort of conscious. And so there isn't anything that only kind of sort of has the property, being conscious. Okay, but now we have the ingredients, right? It's pretty easy to see if you accept all of these things. It's easy to show that each of the Me-Ns is conscious after all. In fact, that it's definitely conscious. Okay, this is the trickle-down mentality argument that you have in your handout. Right, basically, we start from the assumption that definitely I'm conscious. We infer, and here, I think, you don't even have to buy what I said before to think you're entitled to infer this now in a vague object view. But in any case, certainly if what I said right earlier was correct, we'd be entitled to infer that I am definitely conscious, and from that I definitely have the property being conscious. And 4 is just the claim, basically, that I am indeterminately identical with each of these precise humanoid objects. Peter's principle, that's an instance of Peter's principle, is premise 5, right, which says that for anything whatsoever, if it's indeterminate, whether it's identical with me, or I'm identical with it, right, then I definitely have that property only if it's not the case that that thing Y definitely lacks the property. And so from which we can conclude that for all of these precise things over here, it's not definitely the case that they lack the property of being conscious, because each one's indeterminately identical with me, and I'm definitely conscious. I definitely have that property. So each one of these, at the very least, indeterminately has the property of being conscious, or it's at least indeterminately true, sorry, that it has the property of being conscious. But then consciousness isn't vague, tells us that there's no middle ground. Right? If each of those things is at least indeterminately conscious, then in fact it has the property of being conscious. Definitely has the property of being conscious. Okay, so then for all of these things over here, they all have the property of being they definitely have the property, sorry, of being conscious. And so we can conclude that there are very many definitely conscious beings where I am. Basically, it's trickle-down mentality, because there's a trickle-down effect. Like if I, a vague material object, am definitely conscious, then all the rest of the precise material objects over here are at least indeterminately conscious. But then there's no stable stopping point at indeterminate consciousness. There's no such thing. And so all of the precise material objects over here are definitely conscious. Okay, so now we're back to square one again. Okay, but as I said, now we're really in Peter's view. Finally get to Peter's own view. He doesn't accept the hybrid view. He doesn't think that there are any precise macroscopic objects. This leads us to wonder, will salvation for materialism come from the pure view? Unfortunately for the materialist, I doubt it. Although I'll say I'm much less confident about what I say here than about what I said in the previous sections. So basically, we have an argument either for immaterialism or for the claim that Peter's is the only viable version of materialism. Either I have come to destroy or to fulfill, I'm not entirely sure which. The reason, okay, back to the train of thought. Right? The reason is that we can't definitely do away with all the precise macroscopic material objects, at least not while believing in the vague ones. That is, you don't have to, I'm not perfectly sure about this, you don't have to be a hybrid vague object theorist. You don't have to accept that definitely there are all of these precise objects, but you can't definitely do away with all the precise objects. It's at least going to be indeterminate whether there are all of these precise objects. And that's going to spell bad news for materialism. Maybe it's not as bad, like I said at the beginning, but pretty bad news. Okay? If I'm a vague material object, then for each of these collections, the me1 particles, the me2 particles, etc., it's not definitely false that it composes me, and so not definitely false that it composes something. And not only that, I think we can show that it's not definitely false that each of the collections composes something. Okay, so that takes us to this view where we can't just be a complete purist and say that all there are at the macroscopic level are the vague objects. At the very least, there's going to be some indeterminacy. It's going to be indeterminate whether there are also, alongside this vague object, all the precise ones. Okay? But now, the work that we just did in the previous section about Lewis's view is going to come in handy, because all the links for which I just argued, which together take us from the very many precise objects in my situation to the very many definitely conscious beings in my situation, are themselves analytic or conceptual truths, and hence definitely the case. So then, the bottom line is going to be, it's at least indeterminate whether there are very many conscious beings where I am. Okay? So let's just look at the argument laid out somewhat more carefully. It's laid out here in 2 steps on your handout, starting on page 3. Okay, so the first step is what gets you to this conclusion, gets you to 3 there on page 4. That it's not definitely false that for every collection of particles, the me1 particles, the me2 particles, etc., there is something that the particles in that collection compose, right? And the two premises here, the premise one is just that it's not definitely false that there is something that the me1 particles compose. I could have picked any collection there, but it's not definitely false that there is something that the me1 particles compose. That we get from noting, right, that it's not definitely false that the me1 particles compose me. This is what we noted before. But it's definitely the case that if they compose me, then they compose something. Okay, so it's not definitely false that there is something that those particles, the me1 particles, compose. I'm assuming throughout that definiteness is closed under logical consequence. And the second premise is, here I'm just appealing to whatever anti-brutalist intuitions we had to begin with when we were thinking about the argument and composition. It's definitely the case that there is something that the me1 particles compose only if, for every collection of particles, the me1 particles, the me2 particles, etc., there is something that the particles in that collection compose. That is, they all do. Okay, and that's what we can get from the two of those. You can conclude that it's not definitely false that there are all of these precise objects right here. Right, so the justification for premise 1a, as you'll recall, is straightforward. It's neither definitely the case that some of the me1 particles is not part of me, i.e. that the collection has some extra particles, nor is it definitely the case that something overlaps me but doesn't overlap any of the me1 particles, i.e. that the collection has some missing particles. I suppose that still leaves open the merely logical possibility that it's still definitely the case that either it has some extra particles or it has some missing particles. But this seems like nothing more than a merely logical possibility, and those of us who have been rightly taught know that mere logical possibility isn't a species of possibility at all. Indeed, it's barely even a logical possibility if the me1 particles are chosen judiciously. Consider the collection of all and only those particles that are either definitely parts of me or indeterminately parts of me, okay? The errand parts. This collection definitely isn't missing any particles. The errand parts, not to be confused with the me particles, errand particles. This collection definitely isn't missing any particles. It's definitely not the case that something overlaps me but doesn't overlap any of the particles in that collection. I think as maximal as I can. I've taken on board into this collection all of the things that are definitely parts of me and the things that are only indeterminately parts of me. So I'm definitely not leaving anything out. Right? So then it's definitely not the case that the particles in that collection, if it is definitely not the case that the particles in that collection compose me, that can only be because it's definitely the case that some particle in the collection is not part of me. That is, that I'm actually smaller than that thing. But that's not definitely the case. It isn't definitely false that every one of the indeterminate parts is part of me. Right? Sure, I suppose logic, even the logic of definiteness, can't rule this out. Like perhaps each of the indeterminate parts of me is not definitely not a part of me, but they somehow all conspire to make it definitely the case that one of them bows out. Logic can't rule it out, but it's very hard to take seriously as a genuine possibility. Premise I take 1b to be trivial, and premise 2 is justified by the thought that the embedded conditional is a conceptual truth, and so is definitely the case. That is, if we accept, like I said, the anti-brutalist convictions that motivated premise 2 of the original arguments, we presumably do so because we think it follows from the very concept of composition, that the difference of a particle here or there simply can't be the difference between composition occurring and not occurring. And so if one of the collections composes something, then all of the collections compose something. Of course, if it isn't even true that the difference of a particle can't be the difference between composition and not, then it isn't conceptually true. But if it isn't true, we have a much simpler solution to the original problem, right? We just be brutalist and deny premise 2 to begin with. Okay, so the conclusion, the first step of the argument is just as I put it a few minutes ago, we can't definitely do away with all the precise macroscopic material objects. If I'm a vague material object, then it's not definitely false that each of these collections, me1, me2, and so on, that they all, each of those collections composes something. And then the final step, second step, which is the final step of the whole argument, it just essentially recapitulates the trickle-down mentality argument, but now as a series of conditionals which link the very many precise macroscopic objects at the one end to the very many conscious objects at the other end, each conditional of which within the scope of a definiteness operator. And then the conclusion that you get is that the conditional claim that there are very many conscious beings where I am, if there are very many precise beings where I am, is itself definitely the case. And the upshot of that is that if we can't definitely do away with all of the precise macroscopic objects, as we just argued that we can't, then we can't definitely do away with the very many conscious beings where I am. Okay, so you have step 2 there on the handout. I'm not going to read each of the parts. 4, right, is just this claim that it's definitely the case that if you have all of these precise objects, then you have the very many conscious beings. Okay, and okay. From that, right, 3 and 4, you get to 5. It's not definitely false. There are very many definitely conscious beings where I am. So the premises of the argument for 4 are justified, again, by the thought that each of the embedded conditionals there is an analytic or conceptual truth. And so each is definitely the case. I've already argued that they're true in explaining the trickle-down mentality argument, and I've implicitly argued, I think, that they're analytic or conceptual truths. But now, let me be more explicit now. So the conditional in premise 4a is true, if it's true at all, given the meaning of composition and the mereological axiom of extensionality. The conditional in premise 4b is true, given the conjunction of Peter's principle and the principle I've called consciousness isn't vague, each of which I take to be a conceptual truth if true at all. And the conditional in 4c is true, given the failure of the Lewisian loose counting move. Anyone who understands what many means in morally relevant context can just see that it's true. And again, if Lewisian move works, then again we have a simpler solution to the original problem. The conclusion of the argument as a whole is, of course, not quite as bad or as incredible as the conclusion that there are very many definitely conscious beings where I am. But it's still pretty bad and still not credible. How should you reason about whether to donate a kidney or bungee jump or do countless other things when it's not definitely false that there are millions of other definitely conscious beings whose lives you'd be putting on the line? It's far from clear, but clearly not in the way that you actually do. You have to take account of matters being very metaphysically murky in morally important ways. I doubt any of us could consistently believe that that's how we ought to reason, and I doubt any of us could consistently reason in this way. So I doubt anyone is a consistent materialist. But taking my cue from a much more careful and powerful metaphysician, I'll be content if I've convinced you of this. It's very hard to be a consistent materialist.
I don't think it's all that implausible to say that there are no precise objects, that is, objects such that the x's compose those objects. So if there were, then there would be, everything would be actually cut up. If my answer to the special composition question is right, then there would be objects such that everything is definitely caught up in the life of those objects or not. That would mean that, say, when I ingest some sugar and maybe there's a carbon atom in there and it undergoes a chemical reaction, then there would be a precise time when the new compound is formed. But obviously, the time, say, involved in very high energy physics are very, very short compared with chemical interactions. But there would have to be then precise transitions between being caught up in the life of and not. That strikes me as physically impossible. So if it's true that there are only living organisms, then it would be, I think, true that there were only vague Not the way I used vague object, by the way, but the way you used vague object, there would be only vague objects. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, I see, that is your view, right? I mean, the view that there are only the vague objects. And I can see how it's motivated, in part, maybe not exclusively by this, but also by your answer to the special composition question. I don't know if that shows, though, that the argument that attempts to show that at the very least it's indeterminate whether there are going to be all of these precise objects fails in some way. I mean, we would have to, I guess, just weigh the merits of that argument, all the premises there, against the merit of the premises, or the whole book, material means. Right. Yes. Yeah. Right. So I get to that here. But yeah, I guess that I would take that as a reason to deny some premise or other in that argument. I don't know what it would be. I'm not sure which premise would be false here, but I would take that as a reason to believe there's something wrong with this argument. And the argument contained in step 1.
Are we done?
I guess.
Okay.
Thank you. So I think I didn't follow your reasoning for 1A, and I think I'm misunderstanding something, but here was my thought about why this is in 4.2.1, step 1, 1A. My thought was something like this, right? The reason why it's not definitely false that the me particles compose me is because we're presupposing this pure vague object view, right? According to which I am a vague object, right? So your reasoning for that, if I recall correctly, was something like, let's look at the definition of composition, or something like that. And you said the only way that we could show that that claim is false if it's some indeterminate particle is like definitely not a part of the me things, right? Of the things that are composing me. And I was thinking, here's another reason, right? I'm a vague object, right? So it definitely can't be those ones, right? Because those are precise, and those ones are precise, and those ones are precise. So I'm going to point at all of them, and none of them can be me. But that's just because we're presupposing the pure object view, pure vague object view, rather. So I'm wondering if that's incorrect or if I'm getting something wrong there.
Well, I mean, I wasn't looking for, I'm sure if I was looking for sort of the metaphysical explanation of why it would be definitely false, as much as just what would be the way of getting to that conclusion. Meaning, we have a definition of composition, so if it's definitely false that the me particles compose me, it would have to be definitely false that every one of the me particles is part me, and everything overlaps me overlaps. Well, I mean, it seems like we could just check the conditions there, right? Again, I mean, this maybe the same kind of thing goes back to what I said to Peter. I mean, it could be that I can't figure out what's wrong with that line of reasoning, but if someone wants to dig in their heels and say, look, the pure vague object view is just true, I can see it true, or maybe I can derive it from my answer to the special composition question, right, then there has to be something wrong here, even though I can't see what it is. But I don't see how wheeling out the pure vague object view itself could be a response. Just directly explain to me sort of how it's definitely false that the me one particles compose.
I thought I gave that argument just now. I don't know why you think I didn't.
The argument that shows what? If it succeeds, I think it would show that there's something wrong.
There's no me particles, right?
There's no me particles. The me one particles. And I want to know, is it definitely false that the me one particles compose me? So for that to be definitely false, that the me one particles compose me, setting aside this sort of logical maneuver, which I don't think is interest, it would have to be definitely false that it has an extra particle, which is not definitely false, or definitely false that it has too few particles.
It's definitely false that they're the particles caught up in a life, or that their activities constitute a life. That's definitely false.
I want to know, how can it be definitely false that they compose me? When I specify what my...
between particles that are caught up in a life and ones that aren't. That's metaphysically impossible.
Well, we specify what these aren't the me particles, because you said there are no me particles. There's no collection of particles that composes me.
Particles compose something only if their activity constitutes a life. The Me Too particles could not be such that their activity constituted a life.
Yeah, I just don't see, though, how this shows where the reasoning here goes wrong. At most, it seems to show that there's got to be a problem. But, meaning there's just a failure of satisfying the definition of composition. Meaning, to be definitely false, it would have to be definitely the case that the Me1 particles, that there's some one particle in the one particle collection that isn't part of me, or that there's something that overlaps me but doesn't overlap any of the Me1 particles. But since we've specified what the errand particles are, these are not the me particles, because we can't specify anything. I could do which particles compose me. But we can say at least which are the definite particles, the ones that are definitely parts of me, and which ones that are at least indeterminately parts of me.
Yeah. Now we have, of course, abandoned the earlier sharp definition of compose. Right.
No, I've not abandoned that. Good.
Oh,
You want to abandon that?
Well, I did in the book. It's a fuzzy set now that
Yeah.
composes. There's a unique fuzzy set that composes.
Well, that's not the change in the definition of compose, right? So it's the question whether this set composes me, whether it's going to be definitely false that it composes me. It seems like I can answer that question, or at least ask that question, in other words, by asking, is it definitely false that every one of those things in the collection is part of me, and everything that overlaps me overlaps?
Yeah, that's definitely false.
Right. It's gonna. Yeah. Okay. It's gonna have to be on your view. I just don't see how it could be. That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay, I was allowing for follow-ups because I didn't have a long list, but let me make sure that it isn't longer than I realized. David, Lorraine, and now Lara has gone on the list, and so it is getting a little longer, but we still have time. John, did you have a finger on this point, or what was that? What was this?
That was a finger, but you can skip me if you want.
No, I think we're all right. I think we're
So, sorry, I'm just trying to track this debate, and I guess I was wondering if the point was the Me1 particles is a precise group of particles. We're assuming that I'm a vague object, and so I guess I was interpreting Peter as claiming it's just definitely false that any precise collection of particles composes a vague object.
Yeah, I don't know why we would assume that. I don't know. And I mean, it seems like we have very good reason to assume that that wouldn't be the case. Just if you look at the definition of composition and ask, is it definitely missing some parts? Does it definitely have extra parts? And the answer to both those questions is no.
What's the it?
Me, sorry. Is it missing any of the things that are in, start with the collection, Me1. To say that it's definitely false that it composes me, it would have to be the case, and again, it goes back to this unilogical thing. It would have to be the case that it's definitely false that there is some member of that collection that isn't part of me. But that's not true, because we specify the collection so that that's not the case. Or it would have to be definitely the case that there's something that overlaps me but doesn't overlap any of those particles. But that's also not definitely the case.
Well, I'm not going to say anything.
Lorraine.
Yeah, thank you for that really interesting paper. Yeah, I just had a question about the principle that consciousness isn't vague. I'm not, first when you said it, it sounds just like, oh yeah, of course. But then I was thinking a little bit about like just human development and how I started out presumably as a, well, according to my view, as an unconscious embryo and eventually became a conscious being somewhere along the line. So it seems to me plausible that there's going to be some stages there along the way where you have an organism that's not definitely conscious and not definitely unconscious. So I was just wondering what you had to say about that. It just makes me think that maybe that sort of thought makes me want to deny the principle that consciousness isn't vague.
Right. Yeah. So some people have argued that a consciousness can be vague, and one of the grounds for arguing that is human development or development of beings that are conscious. They come to be conscious at some point in time. I'm not sure myself if that argument is compelling only if you assume physicalism, because they also just point to physicalism about the mental as an argument for this. Because so any plausible candidate for being these any plausible physical candidate for being the property of being conscious it seems like it's going to be made of borderline cases, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think if you're a physicalist, and so if you're a physicalist, I think you have good reason, or you have reason to then think that maybe consciousness could be vague. I think this is all the more reason to just reject physicalism. Now, I'm not sure if the objection you're raising and others have suggested stands on its own, can stand if you don't accept physicalism. I mean, if you think that, let's say, they're like just contingent psychophysical laws, contingent or otherwise, psychophysical laws connecting the physical to the mental, yeah, I mean, maybe these laws just do pick up on some perfectly precise thing. I really have no idea, what these laws are. I don't think we'll ever know with that degree of specificity what the laws are. So yeah, maybe the laws just are that specific, and then we'll say, yeah, at that point, that's when the thing becomes conscious. Of course, it'll be forever unknown to us when that is exactly. But I don't see any obstacle, if you're not a physicalist, to thinking that consciousness just pops into existence at that point.
Yeah, so my question was basically on very similar issues, so just to be brief. So, yeah, I think other people have persuasively argued that there's totally independent reason that if you're a physicalist, you should think consciousness is vague, having to do with every plausible physicalist analysis, the neurons, global workspace, higher order thoughts, et cetera, are all vague. And suppose you believe that. Suppose you thought there was entirely independent reason that if you're a physicalist, consciousness is vague. Does then this immaterialist argument from the many about this worry of multiple conscious creatures, does that give us any additional reason to reject physicalism if we've already accepted from these other independent reasons that consciousness must be vague if physicalism is true, or does it give us extra reason over and above the vagueness? Sorry. So suppose we accept for a totally independent reason that if you're a physicalist, consciousness is vague. Then upon hearing this argument, this immaterialist argument from the many about this worry that there's lots of conscious creatures, does that give us any independent reason to reject physicalism or not?
I would think it gives us, I thought you were going to ask, does it give a physicalist independent reason to be a physicalist? Does it give a physicalist independent reason to be a materialist about human persons?
Oh, yeah, I was thinking physicalism more broadly, or physicalistic kind of consciousness.
Right. And now you want to say, sorry, I'm not following, so that this argument all by itself gives us further reason to reject physicalism?
Like, take the physicalism about consciousness, that to be conscious is just to have some neuronal thing or behavioral thing or whatever. Does this argument give us any additional reason to reject that view once we've already swallowed that any such account is vague?
No, I don't think so. So, just help me see, though, is that a problem, though? If it's a problem, that would help us know.
For the dialectical structure, I guess, if we already have the... But anyway.
So physicalism is one thing, materialism is another thing, right? So, yeah, that if they were the same thing, that would be a big problem, I think, with dialectical structure. Yeah, thank you.
Way into that.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Only sort of, okay. Like you indeterminately hear me? So this is just a clarificatory question from someone who's a total outsider to this debate. It seems like, and I might have misunderstood the argument. It seems like there are all these collections of particles in this space, and then you're identifying exactly one of them as me, and then pointing out that there are these other ones sort of share these features of me in a way that's potentially problematic. I mean, just the question is, why identify one of these with me? Why not say, what I am is all the things. That's the thing that's conscious. The reason it's conscious is because each one of them is conscious, and in fact, they're all like thinking about the same thing. There's no weirdness like this one's conscious and thinking about dogs, this one's conscious and thinking about flowers. How can they both be me? I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is sort of like, why set up the debate by presupposing that me is like a single collection of a single definite collection, and there are these other nearby things that aren't me? Unless I've just misunderstood what's going on here. Yeah.
So I was assuming that at the outset, right? That's what I am. I'm composed of some collection of particles that definitely composes me. There's some specific collection there, right? And that's what gets this started, is that you're going to have all these other ones that seem to be equally good candidates for being conscious. But the question is, what's the alternative? So one alternative is basically that Peter's view, that we just deny premise one, and so that's not true about me. But not only is that true about me, there isn't any other thing there that's conscious. That's what makes this a way of avoiding the very many conscious beings where I am. But it sounded to me like you were suggesting that however exactly I'm supposed to understand what I am and my relationship to all these things, all of these things are in fact conscious. But that's not to deny the very many conscious beings here. It's just to accept it. So that's to go the route, basically, of denying premise 5 and saying, yeah, there are all these these very many conscious beings here. The reason I don't go that route is because of the moral and practical consequences or conditions.
Yeah, okay. So that's really helpful. I guess what I was thinking is, if you identify me with the sort of entire collection of conscious, but there are 10 things that are conscious, me is those 10 things. I sort of can't see any like moral or practical claims that we want to come out true that don't come out true. For example, like if you want to punish me for murder, you're going to have to punish all 10 things. But that's fine because like they all go to jail together or they stay out of jail together. If we want to say that I'm conscious of the fact that there's like a big screen in that room, that's fine because what it is for me to be conscious of that is for all 10 things to be conscious of that, and that's true. It's not like 9 of them could be conscious of that, and one of them's like thinking about something else or something. Yeah. So I guess maybe if you could just say a little bit more about the moral practical problems seem to come from identifying one of the 10 things with me, but not the other 10.
So the moral and practical problems really, at least the ones I find most compelling, don't turn on any of them being me. I mean, the minute where you are, there are millions of conscious beings, I think the problems arise. I mean, the argument that Simon gives, I think, is quite good. I mean, I don't know how to get around that conclusion that when deciding to whom I should donate a kidney, I should have to measure their surface area or the thickness of their skin. Right? If there's something that's morally irrelevant, it's the thickness of the person's skin. Right? To deciding that kind of question.
Well, but it might be that it's the proper units of morality aren't beings.
Yeah.
They're
not
people. And
right.
people are composed of, 1 million to 1,000,005 beings, depending on like how fat they are or
phony response I can manage to maybe even take seriously. Someone, I forget who, it's just recently written an article pushing that response. Yeah, the question of whether these hedonic beneficence principles, he calls them, when you're deciding to whom to donate, you should presumably give to the N rather than the M if N is greater than M, and then have you fill in the N what? The N persons, the N conscious beings. That's a tricky issue maybe, and I'm not sure myself. It seems to me that what matters is how many sentient beings do you have there. I don't know why they have to be persons at all. Suppose we weren't even talking about human beings. We weren't talking about anything that we could consider a person, but you still thought it had some interest just in virtue of being sentient. Right? So it would have those moral and practical implications.
I wanted to ask about whether maybe ways of resisting the argument by saying that among all these collections, right, maybe some of them are actually special. So you care about being conscious, right? And the question is, which of these objects are conscious? And maybe one could say that it's the object that generates consciousness. And I'd say that maybe my hands or my fingers are really relevant for that, but it's going to be just some brain matter. So you could say that it is whatever it is, whichever object, whichever particles are actually generating consciousness, that's the one object that I am. And if you think that consciousness is a sharp property, then there will be one minimal physical array of particles that will generate consciousness, and I am just that.
Okay, so I'm not, tell me if I understood the question. The question, the suggestion is maybe there really is just some one distinguished object here. They're all the objects here, but only one of them is distinguished. It's conscious, and definitely conscious. It's a precise object. Peter's solution, yay. And all these other things are not conscious, despite the fact that there's just a difference of a particle here or there. That's the idea?
Yeah, well, it's like take the smallest amount of particles that can generate this much phenomenal character that they have.
But the problem is...
If you take one less, it's going to be less consciousness, so then you have to put that in.
The problem is you can take one less and then add one on the other side. Right? So the way I like to think of this, I think the most compelling way of thinking of the problem to many, right, is not in terms of things that are proper parts of other things, but things that just massively overlap and are otherwise completely indistinguishable. So, I guess in the real world, there are probably going to be some extrinsic properties that are going to distinguish them. But intrinsically, physically speaking at least, they're going to be exactly the same.
To join you there.
Thanks.
Thank you.